All right, it is time to call to order our meeting for today, and we'll go ahead and start with the roll call, please.
Councilmember Dennehy?
Here.
Councilmember Gonzalez? Absent. Councilmember Jaquez?
Here.
Councilmember Reed?
Here.
Councilmember B. Smith?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Hamrick? Absent. Mayor Smith?
Here. And then, you just turn the timer.
I just joined.
Oh, here, all right, we've got John. Very good. Liquor licensing.
So we're going to talk about two very exciting topics today. They're completely unrelated to one another. So we're going to start with liquor licensing, and then we're going to talk about the Fair Campaign Practices Act. So the purpose of the liquor licensing training, I guess, is the best word for it, is to just kind of go over the liquor license process. And really, when you're making decisions, what the criteria is for those decisions. I know we've had some conversations regarding questions that you've asked in the past that perhaps maybe aren't really relevant or part of the criteria. So, and Cindy of course, Cindy's the one who handles all the processing, so if I say anything incorrect, I expect her to jump in and correct me. So when you apply for, we're going to start with new licenses and then we'll talk about some of the other licenses, but when someone applies for a liquor license, they fill out state paperwork. They're required to fill out state paperwork. There's no longer any city paperwork. There used to be a supplemental application, but that's a little beyond what's allowed under the liquor code, and you're pretty bound by what's in the liquor code even though you're home rule. So there's some tweaks you can make to things, but generally the process is set forth in the liquor code. And so they file the application, and Cindy starts the process. She reviews it for completeness, and then if it's complete, she'll send it off for an investigation, which is performed by the police department, CBI, and then the FBI. And it's a fingerprint-based investigation. And then once that comes back, she performs a function on your behalf because you act as the liquor authority, and she transmits the results of that investigation to the applicant 5 days before your hearing. So all new liquor licenses go to public hearing. That's how it's done. And you guys sit as the liquor licensing authority in Canyon for new licenses. And so when you get a license, there's several different criteria that you can look at during your hearing process. And I want to talk a little bit about the hearing process. Some communities have a more formal process. They put people under oath, and it's a very structured. There's, people can cross-examine one another. Parties and interests can cross-examine one another. You guys don't get a lot of liquor licenses, and you don't have very many controversial liquor licenses, so none of that has really been an issue. But you can have a very formal process if you want. The law does limit who's allowed to testify at a public hearing for a liquor license, and they're called a party in interest under the statute, and it's the applicant, adult residents of the neighborhood, and we'll talk about the neighborhood in a second, an owner or manager of a business that's in that neighborhood, or the principal or representative of any school located within 500 feet of the proposed premises for the liquor license. So let's say for just conversation's sake, your neighborhood is the city of Canyon City, which is fine, it can be. This means that a resident of the county who has no business ownership within the city is not technically able to testify at the hearing or provide evidence. The city has never been very strict with those rules. It's never been an issue, but technically that is the rules under the liquor code. So once you're in the hearing, there's certain criteria that you can look at to make your decision. And this is your questions list that you use that we've provided to you, and it goes through that criteria. So the first one is any facts or evidence adduced as a result of the investigation. So if someone's criminal history comes back with something, let's say there's a felony on their record, and you get that information, the applicant knows that as well, and in the liquor code, if someone is not of what's called good moral character, which includes a felony conviction, they are not allowed to hold a liquor license. You are the sole determiner of whether someone has good moral character. So if, let's say a criminal background check came back and someone has a felony, then you would go through, you're required under law to see if there's any rehabilitation or any additional things that might mitigate. Maybe that felony is 25 years old and they have a clean record since then. You know, maybe, you know, they've done a lot of work in the community to try to mitigate what they've done. So you're allowed to ask those questions if someone has that kind of criminal history. That criminal history can also include crimes of moral turpitude, which is an undefined word in Colorado, but it's typically fraud, embezzlement, anything that would be theft, anything like that. So those types of crimes, which may or may not be felonies. So those are kind of that's the criminal history record or anything like that. Oftentimes, you know, the police department may have contacts with somebody that don't result in something that might show up on their criminal record. And one of the things that the police department does when they receive the application from Cindy is they do review that, and if they have knowledge, they may weigh in on that applicant that goes to the good moral character and reputation of the applicant. So that's the first criteria. And then the second criteria is back to this neighborhood. So it's the reasonable requirements of the neighborhood, and that's the language from the statute and has been since probably the dawn of time. And so part of this is about distances that are required either under the liquor code or under your code. You have revised your code in part with some of these distances, and there's other restrictions. And what this is really this and the next criteria, the desires of the adult applicants, are very interconnected. And so you're just basically seeing, like, you know, let's say, you know, on your main street, you have, like, it's just bar, 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 bar. You may say, you know what, the neighborhood, it doesn't need another bar. Or, you know, they haven't been able to show that the desires of the adult inhabitants of the neighborhood really want this another bar, you know. And one of the ways that they often, you know, show the desires of the adult inhabitants is through the petitions that you see. That's the easiest way, but technically all those people could come and testify at the hearing on behalf of, or write letters on behalf of the applicant. So petitions are easy, and that's why everybody does them, but they're not actually required. And before, I think that you kind of had a criteria that they had to have a certain number of signatures on that petition. You can't dictate that either. You've got to weigh that when that comes to you. Is, you know, if a petition comes to you and it's 5 people, you know, is that enough? And this relates back to that neighborhood concept. You guys have not set a neighborhood. You're not required to under the law, but you certainly can. You can set the neighborhood as being the city of Canyon City. Anybody within the city could come and sign a petition or weigh in on an application, and that may be the best way to go about it. Some of my clients, you know, they do a distance from the proposed location, so maybe 1,500 feet from the proposed location, and it's just the people within that sphere that get to weigh in on the application. And you know, I mentioned, you know, the 5 people on the petition. I had a client one time who it was a hotel, and it was kind of out on the outskirts of town, and there was like nobody within that like 15-foot distance. So there was literally like 1 signature on the petition. And it's like, that's all the neighborhood is. So that can happen too. So we can talk a little bit more about whether you want to set a neighborhood or not at the end here. The 4th criteria is the number, type, and availability of alcoholic beverage outlets located in or near the neighborhood. And this kind of goes to that, you know, bar. This is called an undue concentration of something. Sometimes, you know, especially with small, like, historic downtowns, you'll get people who get their liquor licenses, they get in, and they don't want anybody else down there. And so you'll get resistance on applications, and they'll argue, oh, but there's enough down here. You know, you need to go somewhere else and have your liquor license. Sometimes that happens. I haven't seen that really happen here, but sometimes you'll hear those arguments that it's not really necessary, and there's enough outlets all close to that. And then other pertinent matters affecting the qualifications of the applicant for the type of business being proposed. As you may know, there's probably 15 to 20 different types of liquor licenses in the state of Colorado. They all have varying requirements, which we're not going to go over today because it's kind of, they'll put you to sleep, and that's what I'm saving campaign finance for. So I think, you know, sometimes there's criteria for certain types of licenses where you might want to ask additional questions for the applicant, and we can always assist with that if that kind of application comes about. So that's the criteria that you're to apply. It's a quasi-judicial hearing, so just like all your land use stuff, you're not allowed to talk to the applicant. That's a ex parte communication. They're not allowed to talk to you. Of course, they don't understand that, so that's, you know, you just need to be able to explain that to them. You can't talk to the public about the application. If you ever have a very controversial liquor license application, your email box will be full and your phone will be ringing off the hook.
And you can't sign the petition either, is that right?
That's correct, yes. So you can't, you gotta remove yourself from the whole thing entirely, so. And then once you make your decision and you have your public hearing, and one thing, what a lot of communities do is they do require the applicant to be at the hearing, and they will deny that liquor license if the applicant is not there to present. You guys aren't terribly strict about that, but most of your applicants also show up, so it hasn't really become an issue. When you're ready to make your decision, one thing we haven't been doing but is required under state law is you're required to issue your decision, whether it's a denial or an approval, in writing. So we probably need to start doing that, and you have to lay out the reasons why. And that's why these questions and the criteria are so important, because we need you guys to articulate what you think is important. You often kind of articulate things, but we need you to really connect it to the criteria. So we'll work on that as new licensing comes up. So that's, and once the local government acts, they can get concurrent review by the state and local licensing authorities. A lot do nowadays.
Encourage it, because if not, it takes almost twice as long.
Yeah, because the state won't act till they hear from us if they don't do concurrent review. I think it's more costly, but $100. Okay, that's not too bad. So most do concurrent, so the state's doing their stuff at the same time. Of course, in the dual licensing system in Colorado, if you deny it or the state denies it, they don't get it, even if the other authority approves it. So they have to be approved by both. I have never seen the state deny a license that the local government approved, in my experience. So that doesn't happen very often. So that's the new licensing. I'll pause to see if you have any questions. Oh, yeah.
I want to add one thing. There are a few liquor licenses that we don't have any say in. For instance, the Royal Gorge Railroad is a transportation department. The winery at the Abbey is not one that we're going to deal with. And then the distillery that has been coming in, isn't coming in, I'm not sure where they're at right now. They're supposed to ask us if we have any issues with them, which they skip steps sometimes. But we really don't have a lot of, unless it was something really big, they wouldn't take what we said on that in consideration because it's not one of our licenses. So there are some that we don't have any say on, even if they are in Canyon City.
Yeah, manufacturing licenses, like the winery or a distillery, you will not have a say in. However, I think if you come back and say, our zoning doesn't allow this, the state will pause and say, okay, that kind of thing. So there is actually a section in the form that you sign off on. Oh, really? Okay.
But isn't it also that it meets the code? Even if it is zoned, it needs to meet the codes for having a distillery or a...
They still have to meet building codes, they still have to meet all the city codes. It's just that they don't have to ask us if they can meet there.
Okay.
Yeah, and part of the process, I didn't mention this, but, so let me switch screens just for a second here. So this is what your current liquor licensing section in your code, and we're gonna talk about some of these things in here. But one thing you don't have, and I didn't draft an ordinance for tonight because I didn't want to focus on that, but a lot of communities put the process in their code so that people don't have to go find it in the liquor code. And because there's actually a statute and liquor rules, there's both. And I don't want to adopt, you know, the entire statute and put it here, but the general gist of the process, you might want to consider putting that in there to kind of lay out, I don't know how Cindy feels about that, but kind of lay out the general process and how it's going to work. You know, we'd have to modify it when the state law changes, and it does occasionally. But, you know, you might want to consider doing that and kind of, we don't need to, I don't think, change any of these other things in there. We just really need to add that process. It could be easier for applicants if it's in the code. But
So I have a question. Can you go back to the screen before?
I will try. Can't promise anything.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So when we're normally doing these and we're looking at this, as far as like the what were their responses and, you know, what did you do to try to contact people in there? I mean, we don't, like Cindy's kind of covering that, and we've already got it in our packet. So we already know those answers because we already have the information. So we don't actually have to go through those at the hearing, do we? Or do we need to?
Are you providing?
I give them the, whatever information they need, whether it's
Ah.
petition or anything like that.
Cindy, can you turn your mic on, please?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I give them the petition or anything that comes with the application to be turned in.
So we've kind of seen everything, and so I guess that's even when we were doing things before, why I guess I didn't necessarily worry about parts of it was because we already knew what they did. We already saw the results.
And so I think, you know, just for a good record, is to say, like, to acknowledge that that's in the packet. Like, I see that you've contacted all these people and they're happy about your liquor license. That's great. I'm glad you're having those great, you know, neighborhood relationships.
Okay,
and
so-
acknowledge that those things are in there. When you say that, so when we draft the written approval, we kind of scoop more, we have a tendency to scoop more in to give it more stuff. But that hints to us that you've read that, you've seen that, you're acknowledging that as them meeting this criteria.
Okay, because that's part of why I was like, I'm not going to ask them what they did because it's annoying because they just did all the work and I should have read my book.
And
Yeah, so that's, I mean, that's a great point. So if the, you know, if the answers have been, if the questions here have been answered in the written materials, you don't have to ask these questions, you just have to acknowledge it, you know.
Gotcha.
And, you know, you can say, I see your petition, it's got 200 signatures, that's great, you know, whatever, and just kind of acknowledge that it's in there as you go through the criteria. Because again, you don't get them very often, so it's a little harder, you don't get into good practice because you're not, you know, doing them all the time, but once you, like, get the hang of it, you'll just be like,
I'm glad we don't do them all the time.
yeah, I mean, we have clients that have like monthly liquor authority meetings that go for like hours. That just have that many permits.
It must just be terrible to have that much economic development. I just pity them.
That's when you hand it off to a different group of people that you appoint. And
That's where you get bar.
But it's also good to answer these questions because some of the information you get in your packet is not in the public packet. So they don't always get all the petitions, all the things 'cause of the redacting thing. They can get it if they would ask, but then we would redact a bunch of stuff off of them. And so you will get things that the public might not get to see.
Okay.
Yeah, like for one, the criminal history is not provided to the public and would not be provided to the public.
Okay, so then how, let's say we know that something like that happens and it comes up there, so do we say that? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, then you
the
better.
actual document itself is never released to the public, but if someone were to have a conviction, you absolutely, it's part of the process. And so
Okay.
you'd be like, I see you have a conviction for a felony, you know, you don't, that, you know, getting into what the felony is for, I don't think you need to say. But, you know, you do have a conviction for a felony from 10 years ago. Tell me about, you know, your time since then, you know, what steps have you taken? What have you done in response to that experience? Without being like, oh, you were, you hit and run, you killed somebody,
Right.
in a hit and run, yeah.
That makes sense. I just was like, oh, that could be bad.
Yeah.
We have Councilmember Huckes.
Mine is kind of like a twofold question. One of them is going to be where people can come in and say, we don't want this here, this, and all that other stuff. And we take that into consideration and say, whether it's a majority of the council or stays just one individual and want to deny it. And you mentioned something about the answer has to be given back in a written explanation as to why we're saying no. So that would apply in that type of a situation. And the other one is, say no one comes in to complain about that liquor license coming in, but myself, I look at it and I say, okay, this block has 3 liquor stores, and now we want to add a fourth one. And personally, I feel that I don't see the need for a fourth one in this entire area myself. So I would probably say no to that applicant. So would it be just my written response as to the fact that, or does it have to be the council's written response?
It's the council's decision as the authority that it goes into writing.
Okay.
But in your second scenario, I mean, like land use, you guys bring personal knowledge to these things. You're not necessarily out there investigating, but you bring your own, you live in this community, you bring your personal knowledge. And so like something like that is, that's item number 4. I mean, I think you have a lot of discretion to say, I think there's too many on that block of this or whatever. Even if they've got a petition of 300 people that say it's okay. It's fair to express that opinion and vote no if that's how you feel it's just the concentration is too much or whatever it is.
Okay, and my third one is probably self-explanatory. The new liquor license law that you're explaining to us now has no bearing on, or does it have any bearing on when we're having, say, an activity at Veterans Park and they want to get a liquor license for that event? Does this play any kind of role in that?
No, and we're going to talk about special event permits in a second.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Can I clarify one thing? We would only have to write a letter if we denied the license altogether,
I think the law says either way.
even if they just have one person that said no? No, I meant if we were writing the denial, you're either gonna write a denial or a
Correct. I'm only gonna
acceptance,
write the
approval.
decision of the
Yeah,
entire council.
Yeah, as a decision. If one person didn't want it, that, we wouldn't have to write a letter for that.
No.
Yeah, okay, that's what I wanted to
sorry.
clarify.
So does our code currently not have like a algorithm of how many bars there can be or liquor stores within a certain square mile? It's just based on what we feel is appropriate or not appropriate.
Yeah.
Community character.
What'd you say?
Community character.
The community
Yeah,
factor.
yeah. I mean, it truly is, and I'll tell you, no codes really have that. It's really a license by license or an application by application decision that's made, and weighing the criteria for each one.
Okay.
Um,
So I have a question for council. Does putting the process in the code, is that something that you would like to see?
As far as limiting,
No, just the process. This, if you
Oh,
want to
yeah.
get a new liquor license.
Like you go to hearing, and these are the
then you-
notice
this
requirements
just
and
is-
that kind
That
of.
seems more
It
business
goes right along
friendly.
with the business-friendly component, just to be able to check it out and know what to expect. so.
Yeah. More information is always better, as long as it's clear and not too long. And I have another just curious question for council too, when you talked about, having a radius of where those petitions go. And my question mostly comes because I have a friend that lives downtown Canyon City, and it happens to be across the street from a bar. And in the summer, when the weather's nice, they're outside, and it is crazy noisy for them to live. And so I just imagine that sometimes those neighbors that live within a certain radius might have stronger opinions than just somebody who might live 4 or 5 miles away who doesn't care what that impact would be to the smaller neighborhood. How many communities do you see doing that?
Designating a neighborhood.
Yeah.
Quite a few of the, your size and bigger do designate like a certain. Some do it like per application. I'm not like a fan of that. It adds
Yes.
another step because either the authority sets it for that application, or that is delegated to your clerk, and then she's making the decision. And what if you don't like the decision she made? It's just kind of messy. So if you're gonna pick a neighborhood, I say everybody gets the same neighborhood, whatever it is. You just do
It's
it by
the same.
resolution, and you say this is our neighborhood. So that's if you're gonna choose one. Yeah. that's how I would do it.
What are some opinions from council about that?
I mean, I get what you're saying, but I feel like if it was still all of Canyon City, they could still come because they would be in it. But would that prompt, I guess the thing that puts that into consideration is when you say the neighborhood and it's all of Canyon City, if they are seeking out those petitions on their own, are they going to be actively informing people within that closer radius and getting signatures from them? Or are we talking about, North Canyon and we're getting signatures from Dawson Ranch? You know what I'm saying? Where it's not
so-
relevant, so the conversations aren't happening where they're meaningful, so.
Yep. So that's one advantage to closing in the neighborhood, is that they have to talk to the people who are most directly affected by the application. So like you say, if the neighborhood's Canyon City, they can go randomly out into the residential areas that aren't affected by the bar necessarily or the liquor license and get signatures. So one advantage, is that you hear from the people who are actually affected and you're forcing the applicant to make that contact.
I kind of like the foot radius more so than saying like Main Street or East Main
Yeah,
or
I
something
agree,
like that. So
foot
that
radius.
way, it's not
Yeah.
only like just like the businesses there. Because I wouldn't like that either, where like all the businesses are like, oh no, we're good. We all
Would it be
we all
that,
agree we don't need any more.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I gotcha.
could you make it just like a half-mile radius?
Yep.
Mile
absolutely.
radius?
Yep.
See, and then that way you're incorporating it a little bit bigger, but you're staying in that general zone of where it's gonna be.
And we
but-
give them a map, so when they go out
Right.
with their petition.
And I see that. On one hand, I see that. On the other hand, it's like, it's still a city thing. And we're trying to make this better for the people who live there, but we don't know how long they're gonna live there. And the next person, that's another thing. And I've gone through this, I've gone through the process of a liquor license before, and I mean, it takes a little work. When you're doing this, it takes some work, so the people are doing their work, but, I think maybe the mile radius or something like that, I'm okay with that.
You could also look, you have your districts, that's another set map that you guys have. I will say, just getting petitions in, if the local people do them, they seem to get them in their area, because they either have a business or they're working in their business and they get people there. There's a couple that use a company that come in, it's everywhere.
Everywhere.
They're just wandering,
It's everywhere,
yeah.
yeah. They wander, because I stop them at my house when they tell me things. Well, the city of Canyon City told me to come. No. I have an X on my thing. They don't like coming to me because I'm like, oh, wait, that's not what you're supposed to say. That is not right. But I've noticed the difference. If our local people do it, they do seem to do it at their business, and they really do go around that neighborhood. If we have a professional company come in with some of these, we don't see that as much.
Brandon, what are your thoughts?
I kind of agree with Tim on his second part. I mean, ultimately, it's going to affect the entire city more than just the people around there. And I'll use Griffin's as an example. Greg's new place. I know that when it was a bar, there was quite a controversy with the noise and how busy they were and the hours that they kept. But that person ultimately with the problem removed themselves from the home that was encroached or close to that business. And I mean, I think that's kind of a choice. If you're going to choose to live by a busy main street with bars and restaurants, that's where you choose to live, and those things kind of coincide. If you're not a late night owl, then you probably shouldn't live close to busy commercial restaurant / bar areas.
Frank, do you have any opinion on the matter? Okay. So we have the direction to move forward with putting the basic process into the code. I don't know, just want to think about the circumference area. I don't think that's something that's really pressing right now.
No. it's
I
not
don't think we've
pressing.
had a lot of controversies. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I just got a message. Dolly's out there somewhere trying to get on the panel.
Oh.
Dolly's in space. I don't know if anybody could bring her in. She says she needs a link.
Oh, she still needs the link.
She's listening.
And Mayor
Sorry.
Pro Tem Hamrick, you're welcome to chime in anytime you want to, too.
Thank you very much, but I'm satisfied with the conversation that's gone on so far.
All right, so are we ready to move on to the next liquor licensing?
Yeah, so I just want to talk a little bit about your administrative applications. So there's three types of applications that Cindy handles for you, your clerk handles for you. It's special events, like what Frank was alluding to. Special events are very limited in who can apply for them under state law. So that's a pretty restrictive license. It's only for that event. And there are some exceptions if the drinks are gratuitous by the glass, and if there's an entry fee, it's equally applied. They don't need a special event license. So she handles all those. You used to handle those, and you delegated those to her. The other item the other type of license that's delegated to her is renewals. Renewals have a special kind of component to them. They go through the investigation referral process as well. And she can bump them up to you if there's an issue, and they will go to hearing if they are bumped up to you. But otherwise, she can grant a renewal. So that makes your life a little bit easier. And then the code also has tasting applications. So these are only for certain types of licenses can have tasting applications, and she handles those as well. I don't know, you don't get very many of those. Yeah.
We have Righteous Thunder Road has one, and Jewett's has one.
I do want, oh,
Is that special event licensing for tastings, or is that for tastings across the board?
It's just tastings only. They can have so many tastings a year.
Okay.
They fill out their permit for us and turn in all their dates, and they get a license for it.
Because I know Sons of Italy does a tasting.
They do a special event. It's
Okay.
it's different than.
So it's different?
It is different, yes.
yeah, they don't have the underlying liquor license to get a tastings license, so. One last thing I wanted to mention is, as you may recall, Governor Polis lifted restrictions on delivery of alcohol and takeout of alcohol during the pandemic. The legislature acted last legislative session to actually codify that, but when they did that, they only did it, it's when there's not a pandemic and only till July 1st of this year. So it's a little weird at the moment. I don't know whether or not they will undertake that in the current legislative session and just make that a thing. I think it's probably worked pretty well in a lot of communities that have it, and so I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes part of the statewide liquor code. And if it does, it may be something we need to add to your code.
So if the state passes it, then we would need to pass it as well?
Potentially, yeah. That might be a license you want to have administrative approvals of, or something like that. So, yeah, we'd probably bring that to you if they did it. But for right now, the time period between now and when that law sunsets is so short, it doesn't really matter, so.
Okay.
All right. So any questions on liquor licensing? Okay. All right. Give me 2 seconds here. Oop. So we provided an outline of a law that was passed last legislative session regarding municipal campaign finance complaints, and this is the draft ordinance that was supplied to you. And I wanted to give you a little background on this issue. So I believe in 2018, the Secretary of State passed a rule. The Secretary of State has rulemaking powers, and said basically like municipal campaign finance complaints need to go to the clerk. And there was a rather large brouhaha over whether or not that was contrary to the state constitution and the Fair Campaign Practices Act. I think the consensus is that it was, and that Secretary of State acted outside their bounds. However, the legislature stepped in and codified that rule, making it compliant with state law at the very least. And so now all municipal campaign finance complaints will go to the city clerk. And so that's complaints about candidates spending money, taking money. That is complaints about committees of all sizes, and complaints about the city if we were to spend money in violation of the Fair Campaign Practices Act to advocate for a ballot issue for or against, the complaint could be filed with the clerk. So, in response to that, obviously you have no process for this because that was not the law a couple of years ago. And so we are suggesting that you add this to the code, and this basically follows the process that the Secretary of State would follow. So it's the same process if it were to go to the Secretary of State. We're just kind of adopting that framework. So that's pretty much the campaign finances topic. It's pretty short. There is one component that I wanted to talk to you about. And so the complaint is filed with the clerk, as I mentioned. There's some deadlines in here. She reviews it, and then it can go to a hearing officer. Obviously, we recommend that hearing officer be an independent party. That hearing officer should not be counsel. Some communities have it as their municipal court judge. We have not broached this with Judge Allen. He may have no interest in doing this. It's not a constant issue. It'll only be an issue during election season, hopefully. And so the other thing you can do is you can always just bring in another lawyer or someone to be a hearing officer. It will need to be someone that has some grasp of campaign finance, probably would be ideal. So.
I don't really like the idea of doing our municipal judge because as a city council, we hire him. And so that isn't really independent. I would like to see it be truly independent.
Yeah, and so one option to do that is to put out basically an RFP for a hearing officer. A lot of communities have hearing officers, and just, they'd only be called on when you got a complaint. So, you could go years without a complaint, hopefully, fingers crossed. So that's just one thing in this ordinance that I wanted to specifically point out, is that you probably will need to engage the services of a hearing officer.
And are these complaints only for campaign finance, or is it for other complaints? Because we have had other complaints.
They're only municipal campaign finance.
Okay.
And let's see here. Sorry. These are the rules from the Secretary of State. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling through them so fast. It's probably making you sick. Ryan's feeling nauseous. I just wanted to get to the definition. So it's any campaign finance matter exclusively related to a municipal campaign. So if it's outside that definition, there's no complaint, there's no process for complaining. So Cindy would reject it. And that's one of the bases for rejection, is that there's no actual violation of the law.
Any other questions from council?
I'm confused by the question you just asked, Ashley. What do you mean, like, other complaints? I'm just trying to understand.
Oh, so when I ran for mayor, the person that I ran against, they didn't turn their paperwork by the due date. And so they made a complaint about that their paperwork should still be accepted or have a grace period. And
gotcha.
Cindy, you were the one that made the judgment on whether that was accepted or not. I just wondered if somebody wanted to do an official complaint that it would go independent. I mean, it has nothing to do with finance.
Right, it has nothing to do with finance. So for complaints like that, where there's an administrative decision about a petition or a nomination form or something within the municipal election process, there's a different path for that.
So they have a path where they could take it if they wished to.
To court.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, this is just about money.
The money. Okay.
I have a question. One of the things that you talked about was against the city, like with ballot issues or money on that. Is that something that the city often does? Is
Never.
put finances behind? I didn't think so. So I was just really confused why that was in there, because I didn't think that was a thing. So.
Yeah, so the Fair Campaign Practices Act, it's a little unclear. The law's a little gray on this area as to when it's triggered. But the city, any local government cannot spend money for or against a ballot issue. And it doesn't have to be your ballot issue. It could be any ballot issue.
So, for example, like how we've talked in the past about, like, if something were to ever change with the charter and it needing to go to vote, the city doesn't do anything to promote or.
It's allowed to do a couple of things. So the city as an organization is allowed to do a couple of things. It can pass a resolution in support of a ballot issue or against a ballot issue. It can provide a factual summary, but it has to be fair and balanced. It has to have negatives and positives in it, which is challenging when you're the one putting the ballot issue forth. And so those two things it can do. Now, as individual council members, you are permitted to do more, but you can't use city resources to do so. Staff is also allowed to answer questions that are asked of it without solicitation. So if someone just calls up and says, I don't understand what you're doing with the charter, staff could walk them through, like, these are all the changes, or maybe here's some information or whatever. But you can't spend money to advocate for or against a ballot issue.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Once it's been set on the ballot, and that's where the tricky part comes in, is when is it set? So.
So an example of just sharing factual information, when we did the two-way streets for the 1% tax, we did have a special tab for two-way streets on the city website. But all it had was a map of the streets and what their condition was. It had studies that were done on the street. It had, another study of, the prioritizing which streets should be fixed first based on, a number of factors. It was just all vanilla documentations that people could go to get educated.
And one reason why this is such a hot issue in Colorado is because Doug Bruce has filed quite a few lawsuits against the city of Colorado Springs and other local governments in that area. So there's a lot of case law about, what's advocating and what's not and that kind of thing, so.
But at the same time, there's council members that were on that committee to pass it, but that was when we took off our city council hat and we had an independent committee and we acted independently as a citizen.
Yeah. Yeah, you can act as citizens. You can go out and advocate, but like you couldn't have a town hall meeting in City Hall to do that because you're using city resources. So you have to go somewhere else. Yeah. Any other questions on campaign finance? I told you it'd be super fun. So we'll bring that ordinance forth then whenever it's on the schedule. So I don't know when that
All
will
right,
be.
thank you, Catherine and Cindy, both of you. Appreciate it. Well,
Cindy's
Cindy, you
got
do
a
the
lot of new
day-to-day.
responsibilities now.
The day-to-day. So we're done for now
done
until
for-
our 6 o'clock
yep.
URA meeting. Okay, we are adjourned.